This is Brian Wolf, and you're listening to Green Speech. My guests tonight are Barbara B. Knabel Jr., President of the World Bank and former U.S. Senator for the state of New York.
Good day.
Paul Gilding, leader of Greenpeace International, and author of the book The Great Disruption, How the Climate Crisis Will Transform the Global Economy.
Glad to be here.
And for Elizabeth Dorr, Doctor of Latin American History, member of the Inter-American Foundation, and author of Capitalism and Ecological Crisis, Legacy of the 1980s.
Pleasure to be here.
Doctor, let's start with you. Dependency theory. Is it true that corporate profit margins are destroying Latin America's ecological environment?
Well, that's a gross oversimplification. There are those who believe that the international organizations are operating in Latin America solely due to cheap labor and loose environmental laws.
If I may, many of these businesses are operations in area of little to no population. Besides, there's no crime in increasing profits.
The crime is what has been done to those countries' environments with the use of incompatible European production methods in a fragile ecosystem.
And what would you have these countries do exactly?
Introduce laws which enforce sustainable indigenous production methods.
Your thoughts on this, Doctor?
It's a compelling argument, but immaterial on the grand scheme of things. The system of capitalistic competition doesn't allow for small-scale sustainability. What we really have to do is learn how to separate resource use from profit-making.
It sounds to me like you're talking about sustainable development.
Absolutely.
Well, this is a particularly broad term, so let's narrow things down a bit. Mr. Gilding, your thoughts on liberalizing markets?
Liberalized markets are great in theory, the idea being, of course, that the financial costs of ecological deterioration and resource depletion will force businesses to reduce pollution and conserve the ecosystem.
It is a good system. A company without resources cannot make a profit. It forces shareholders to come down on the side of the environment.
Oh sure, if the land is worth enough to make the operations expensive. But in Latin America, the companies simply pillage the land and leave when there is nothing left to exploit.
Our agency and other financial agencies like us have pushed for environmental regulations to prevent exactly this situation.
Wouldn't regulations that go against profit making hurt these nations' ability to pay the debt they owe to you?
We're interested in long-term ability of these governments to pay their debts, hence our push for such legislation.
While this is technically true, those regulations have been poorly enforced across Latin America. And when you look at the adjustment policies of which the World Bank puts in place, designed for an increase in foreign exchange earnings to repay the debts, you see a very different story.
An increase in foreign exchange earnings means international exportation of resources. Does it not, Dr. Dorr?
Indeed it does, Brian. In fact, order to comply with IMF and World Bank conditionality, many Latin American governments were forced to implement development strategies in opposition of environmental sustainability.
Would you care to comment on this, Mr. Knabel?
That's simply the way a free market economy operates.
At the expense of the land and the people.
That is an unfounded accusation, simply another aspect of your anti-industrial propaganda.
Then how do you explain that in just 1 decade of your free market economy, the percentage of Latin Americans below the poverty line rose from 35% to 50%. That's roughly 80 million members of the Latin American community.
It's not our place to police internal economic policy, naturally enforce debt repayment, but we have been advocating for sustainable development since the 1980s.
Dr. Dole, this would seem to be your area of expertise.
Here we see that once again technical truth differs from the reality of the situation.
How so?
In my opinion, sustainable development has been used by the financial institutions as a way to diffuse opposition of their banking methods. Although the World Bank claims to support environmentalism, they still fund large dams and conventional power plants on a regular basis, neither of which have a positive impact on the environment, instead of funding alternative energy policies.
We're talking about governments who simply don't have the capital necessary to properly invest in alternative energy sources. In these cases, we have to rely on private corporations to implement changes.
So why haven't they done so?
Because it's more profitable not to.
Sad but true, Mr. Gilding. Capitalism depends on the acquisition of profits, which products to produce and how to distribute them is not determined by social need or environmental sustainability. It's determined by profitability. It's up to the consumer to demand eco-friendly commodities and production methods.
Fortunately, a drive to this end is already underway, thanks to people and organizations who care about the preservation of our planet.
Do you agree, Dr. Dole?
Although ecological destruction seems to be inherent under capitalism, there is room for environmental reform. In Latin America, there has been large amounts of local resistance to extreme contamination and natural resource destruction. This has forced the government to take a close look at the environmental impacts of their policies. In a few cases, this has led to a curbing of ecological damage, but unfortunately, it is far more common for policies that protect profits to take precedence over environmental concerns.
Such as in Mexico and Amazonia.
Exactly.
I understand that Amazonia is one of your main areas of concern, Mr. Gilding.
Since the 80s, the Amazon has suffered from deforestation, species extinction, and global warming. Pointless projects such as the Trans-Amazonica Highway have devastated the environment without truly benefiting the local population.
These were not pointless projects. The Brazilian government built the Trans-Amazonia highways in an effort to promote its economy and reduce poverty levels within its borders. It provided jobs and opened up transportation throughout the region.
At what cost? Deforestation in the Amazon destroys the soil, causes flooding, and increases the greenhouse effect. Its only use is as a short-term lumber extraction. How does this benefit the local population?
Landless families were given land to farm and raise cattle. Large companies brought in a much-needed influx of capital to operate a large, unpopulated stretch of land. Those who couldn't afford land were able to find work as laborers on farms and ranches. All of this benefited the people of Amazonia.
The cattle raising created an ecological and social disaster. The land burning was used to clear ground for a ranch and grazing area, caused a decline in soil fertility. These areas became arid wastelands within 10 years.
Dr. Dorr, isn't there some sort of middle ground where both economics and the environment can coexist in Amazonia?
Sadly, no. This is a very specific ecosystem in which any profitable use of the land cannot be readily renewed. I will stress that this was not a well-known fact in the beginning of the economic push in the Amazon. It wasn't until years later that the Amazonian communities and environmental organizations such as Greenpeace exposed the disastrous consequences of cattle grazing in the region.
And what of Brazil's Grande Carajos project? 1/4 of the Amazon being converted into the world's largest industrial and agro-livestock center?
The heart of this project was a series of open-cast mines, nickel, chrome, gold, iron, all of which helped boost Brazil's economy, were mined there. There were also processing plants, steel mills, agro-livestock enterprises, hydro dams, railroads, and river ports. It was a self-contained industrial sector covering 900,000 square kilometers and was capable of supplying 10% of the world's iron ore on its own. On an economic level, it was an amazing project.
It caused deforestation and flooding, animal extinction, and forever altered the Amazonian ecosystem. 1.6 million acres of timbers were cut every year for fuel and construction. It transformed large sections of a rainforest into desert, and it pushed indigenous tribes off their lands.
Very true. It took less than 20 years to go from rampant development with no opposition to widespread environmental concern from every direction. Each of the miners and ranchers in the area reversed their position on production in the Amazon. This has been called the greening of the discourse. Despite this, the Brazilian government policy in the Amazon continues to promote large capitalist enterprises.
Well, it seems to me that Amazonian environmental concerns have been fairly well covered in the press. But what about the environmental issues of an urban center like Mexico City?
Urban areas like this don't lend themselves to simple moralities like saving the rainforest, and as such, the problems of urban environmental degradation tend to be ignored by most Western ecologists.
And I don't understand why. Mexico City is surrounded on two sides by mountains, and is built upon the dry salt beds of a series of lakes. These geographic peculiarities allow for minimal wind, and so contaminants accumulate in the atmosphere. With excessive levels of population come equally excessive levels of contaminants. This causes Mexico City's infamous air pollution.
Well, then why would a metropolis like this be built?
These cities are integral to the capitalist transformation of agriculture. Large and efficient commercial farms took up large tracts of land and forced the decline of small-scale farming. These workers flooded into the urban centers looking for economic opportunities so they can contribute to their nation's economic system.
It should also be noted that 30 years of mass rural to urban migration were also decades of large-scale industrial expansion. There were tax incentives promoting the concentration of industries in these cities, where the labor force was localizing.
Mr. Gilding, what was done to prevent ecological disaster in Mexico City?
In Mexico, there was the creation of a political party known as the Partido Revolucionario Institucional. They created an ecological movement linked to their party. By the 1980s, however, the party had lost its momentum due to the deplorable quality of life in the capital city.
And what happened to the party?
It managed to turn its image around with a campaign to make Mexico City a greener place to live. It established grassroots organizations throughout Mexico and forced ecology into the arena of political debate. In short, it launched a massive environmental campaign with the people of the nation, but it continued operating within a neoliberal economy. Unfortunately, the PRI were unable to implement two such different strategies simultaneously, and as usual, profits took precedent over the environment.
Well, I'm sorry to say that we're almost out of time for today. I'd like to say to our listeners that environmentalism has emerged as a main form of opposition politics in Latin America, and although it still focuses on particular examples of degradation instead of confronting the social causes, it is still a giant step forward in the right direction. My thanks to tonight's guests, Dr. Elizabeth Dorr, Paul Gilding, and Barbara B. Knabel Jr.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.